and welcome to the Books Applied podcast presented by WSL Leadership. In this podcast, we talk about an awesome book and how it can apply to your work, sport, or life. Today's book is Curious by Ian Leslie, and I have special guest Chris Martin with me here to discuss this book. Hello, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm good, Iggy. I'm excited to talk about this book. It's something that I've been thinking about since I read it over 2 years ago. I didn't realize I read it 2 years ago, but I did, and I wrote down so many notes, and I can't wait to share them with you.
That is fantastic. I can't wait too. And the book itself is from 2014, and I just found it recently, so I just read it a lot more recently than you did, but it's great that it's been a part of your life for a little while. What have you found to be super useful, or what struck you from this book 2 years ago that has kept it in your mind?
Well, what's interesting is there's the things that I remember without looking at the notes. And then when I went back and look at the notes, I'm like, wow, I really wrote down a lot of quotes from this. Yeah. But I think the thing that really stood out, that really kind of affected my business and the work that I do, was the 3 types of curiosity that he mentions in the book. And and I'm sure we'll dive into these, but the diversive curiosity, the epistemic curiosity, and the empathic curiosity. And I love just the idea that there's not just one type of curiosity, but 3, if not more.
Oh yeah. And I think they're fascinating. There are even 3. I didn't think about curiosity before. I'm just like, people are curious or not, whatever. It's a question. You just ask or look or whatever. It kind of makes you think of something. But those divisions were interesting. And then there's like you were mentioning, these sort of subdivisions. Do you want to mention a little bit about what you do and how this affects what your work is? Yeah,
so the simplest way to describe what I do is I'm a producer, which means that I produce creative things for myself and creative things for others. And so I like this kind of two-hand approach to producing and creating things, because it's the stuff that applies to what I do, and then I want to help other people do stuff too. So curiosity plays a huge role in both of those worlds, because when it's yourself, you need to be curious about, what am I interested in today? Especially if you're doing anything creative, whether it's producing a podcast like what you're doing, or writing newsletters, or blogging, or vlogging, or whatever the newest logging is. Right. And curiosity is so impactful on that internal pursuit of creativity, but in the external expression of creativity, curiosity is really that connection to another person.
And I feel like there you're talking about the empathetic curiosity a little bit specifically, to get into the types. The curiosity about what another person thinks and feels. And would you say that what you produce is intended to, you want to drive someone else to be curious about what you're doing and to connect with you in that way? Is that how you see that fitting together?
I see it as part of it, because I've always felt this strong desire for people to connect to themselves as much as another person, because I really feel like there's a lack of internal processing or self-reflection, self-awareness sometimes, that when people can connect to that, I guess, fire inside, or, the dying fire inside, if you want to be pessimistic and sad about it.
Everything's terrible. Yeah.
I know, right? But still, what are you curious about is like a question that I ask almost everyone, because when people say they don't know, immediately it's like, well, I don't believe you.
Why? Yeah. Would you say curiosity is like, well, if someone had no curiosity, I don't know why they would be alive.
Exactly.
A little bit. I think that's kind of where you're going with that, right?
Well, yes. And where it comes up the most is like, well, it's always tied to I don't know if I can make money doing this, or if there's a market for it, or an audience. And the question then becomes, well, what are you curious about? What are you interested in? And then when they tell me, I'm like, well, what's wrong with that? That's awesome.
Right? Yeah. The thing that we live as sort of curious beings drive us as humans to do anything. I don't know that maybe we have curiosity and habits are our 2 things that keep us functioning, right, in this world in some ways. Interesting. let's talk about these different types of curiosity a little bit more. So we kind of alluded to and started with empathetic curiosity, which in the book is like the third one they mentioned that kind of builds on these other two. So maybe we should start back at the beginning, because I feel like they do sort of build on each other in terms of complexity in some ways. And so Ian Leslie, the author here, talks about diversive curiosity.
Yes.
Which is like curious about the novel and trying new things. So this is the what's that shiny thing style of curiosity, I think. Yeah. How do you see that in your world?
Oh my gosh. Like the world of podcasts is the perfect example, because a lot of people will be like, oh, I want to make a podcast. And so they'll do like 3-4 episodes and then they'll move on to the next shiny thing of like, oh, I read this blog or, this social media post, and now I'm going to go do this. And then I'm going to go do this. And then I'm going to go do this. And so it's this constant pursuit of not only the novel and the new, but I think that next validation point of, like, oh, I'm going to be an influencer or a YouTuber. And then the next shiny thing pops up. Usually when an algorithm changes.
Right. TikTok, that's where it's at now. Yeah,
exactly.
Right. Or whatever is the next thing. Interesting. So you'd see the diversive curiosity in terms of, from your perspective, just how people pursue getting their persona out to others. Like they are constantly pursuing a new venue, a new style. Like, oh, I'm a microblogger now. Like, oh, I'm a like Twitter is where I'm at. Like, oh, where, like images. I'm all about Instagram, whatever it is, as like sort of the next way to, as self-expression, it seems like. Do you think that what do you see as a result of that? Fundamentally, this is not a bad thing. I would say, like, explore. I'm all about exploration. Try something new. Get into it. I know plenty of people with 4-episode podcasts. I know plenty of,
yeah, no shame there.
Yeah, that's where you got to try stuff out to see if it's going to work. I think the hazard becomes if that's all you're doing is trying the first 10% of 90 things. You haven't accomplished really much other than 10% of 90 things at the end of that. Right.
Well, I think too, the phrase that's popping up into my mind right now, there's two phrases actually. The first is the word, multi-hyphenate. And I think when people are multi-hyphenates, meaning that they do many different things, I think that in a way is a form of that diversive curiosity, because, I consider myself a multi-hyphenate because I love filmmaking, podcasting, and writing and speaking and all of these things. And that really is that expression. But then I start thinking about, well, the jack of all trades, master of none kind of thought. And I think that's the world, I think, of diverse curiosity.
Right. And I think, and we are judgmental about it, like, oh, the master of none part is like, well, if you were master of anything, that'd be fine.
Yes, exactly.
On the flip side, though, another book that I mentioned on this podcast, I don't know if you've read it, is, what's it called? It's about being a generalist and how it's actually exactly it. I knew you would know what it was. I'm glad you're here to help remind me what I read.
I am your brain.
Yeah, I love it. Any day you're hired. But like the idea that if we are a generalist, we have done sort of a more shallow exploration of many things, a wide range of things, but not necessarily a significant depth of things. And so there is value in range, but we have this judgment of like, oh, the master of none. Like, okay, well, once you grow up, once you get together, once you pursue your career, then everything's together. And I think range brings that back to like, you're actually not better off, not happier, and you're not going to do better when you pursue something deeply if you haven't done this sort of wide survey first. Like range is, I think, premises that we specialize too soon and too much often, and to the detriment of ourselves and our development. So how do you hold those two contrasts?
I feel like you need both. Like I think you need to be a generalist and a specialist. And I think if you can be a generalist about the world but a specialist in yourself, I think that's where it gets really philosophical and interesting.
Yes, that's great. Specialist about yourself. I think, and you mentioned this earlier on, that I would agree that people don't seem to really know themselves super well often. And that sort of plays out in the conflicts people get into or the unhappiness, like the situations where they feel either trapped or not sure, or they've pursued something. They're like, oh, I shouldn't have pursued this, whatever it is, a job, a 4-episode podcast, whatever it is. They're like, that didn't quite suit me or whatever. But I think it's interesting. And that does play into the negative side of diversive curiosity, that we're like just moving on too quickly to pull out any knowledge that's useful. And I think there is, which brings us, I guess, fundamentally to the second phase, which is epistemic curiosity.
Yes.
How do you want to give a explanation of what that looks like for you?
For me, it's like if I'm interested in podcasting, for example, I'm going to dive deep into the subject of podcasting. So maybe I'll understand about microphones or editing software. Or for me, I usually pick like a subsection of the thing and dive into that and explore that. So instead of multiple creative pursuits, you're picking one and going deeper and really thinking about it and really going and learning more, developing knowledge. I know Leslie in the book talks about how slow and painstaking epistemic curiosity is because there's sustained cognitive effort and there's work. And generally speaking, when we're bouncing about, maybe it's an avoidance of work and not really wanting to commit to one thing and really diving into it and exploring it.
Yeah. And he does mention Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It is physiologically more difficult to think deeply on things for time. Like we run out of energy for that. We run out of focus. We run around. Like it is literally hard to do. Just like lifting a heavy weight. Like that is hard to do if it's heavy weight, right? And so that idea that it still has value to pursue something deeply. It's interesting that you say that if you're looking at a thing broadly, you're like, oh, I'm going to find the piece that's interesting to me in this and like go in a little bit deeper and figure out what this part is like. And I think that is the Leslie's definition adds on like the quest for knowledge and understanding. So versus this curious about everything and new things is diversive, but epistemic is knowledge and understanding, which is a deeper level than just what is this thing? Like, okay, shiny, great, next, And so but it does take more disciplined effort that you have to, because it is hard, and hard things are hard is a very popular term. And so to pursue something that's challenging and difficult, you have to want to or desire to, and it is effortful.
Yeah. Well, he talks too about this thing called the curiosity zone, that when we don't know anything or we know too much about a subject, we're not as curious as when we have just enough knowledge to really fuel our understanding. So it's almost like an upside down U shape, where that middle point is where, our curiosity is at its highest when our knowledge about it's in that middle ground.
Right. And that you're kind of skipping ahead 27 chapters, but he talks about how we need some factual knowledge in order to be curious. Like we're not curious without some baseline knowledge. Like they're like the unknown unknowns, right? Like I'm not curious about something I have no idea about. But once I learn about it a little bit, and once I learned enough about it, like if I learn about it a little bit, I'm like, oh, the name of a person I don't know. I'm like, oh, great. Who's Sally? I don't even know, whatever. But then if I know, I'm like, oh, Sally does this. I'm like, oh, tell me more about Sally. Like she's an astronaut. I mean, like whatever it is, like I'm suddenly more and more curious as I learn a little bit more knowledge. But then once I get a ton of knowledge, I'm like, oh yeah, I know everything about her, whatever, old news.
Exactly.
There is that piece in the middle. And I think one of the chapters that I struggled with actually was when he talks about schooling, which I'm like, dude, you're out of your depth a little bit, but I'm like, okay, I'll like humor you. But that the purpose of school is actually to give a lot of random factual, not random, he doesn't say that, but I would say, judgy on my side would say a lot of factual knowledge that might be, it's not about you're going to use it again later. It's about this is going to spur curiosity for you later to know a little bit of math, know a little bit of science, know a little bit of, the humanities and the arts, know a little bit of history, know a little bit of, all these different things. That the purpose is that it's a broad range of things and maybe more superficial knowledge so that later you're curious enough to go deeper. And my actual problem, I'm like, okay, I guess that's the point of school. I have a degree in experiential education, right? And he throws experiential education in the boat with constructivism and some other things. So I'm like, you don't get it. Dude, no one gets a degree in constructivism, but you do get a degree in experiential education. Like it gets sort of like, I don't know, like the assumptions about what experiential education means are different in the popular sphere as they are in the more technical sphere, I would say. And so the idea that we learn from experience is meaningful. And that's like the point of this pursuit, that like how we learn best from experience. But I think the creation of knowledge from experience is a different thing. I'm not going to hand you a rope and be like, hey, learn some knots and we're going to go climbing. It's going to be amazing. You know, let's figure it out together. No way. Like that's not experiential education. Like that is not like a meaning. That's like a constructivist, you know, pursuit. Like we're going to teach ourselves by playing with this thing how to not die. I'm like, that seems silly. But that's kind of how some of these education forms are viewed. So that's my one beef, is that he doesn't know what experiential education means fundamentally in the technical sense. But in the reality, I'm like, I came around though. I'm like, no, school's about socialization for sure. But I think the socialization aspects of school too, I'm like, oh, this just makes us curious about socialization later. Like this, like, okay, I can accept that as another piece, that we're being trained to do these sort of outdated tasks as one version. He also throws, what's his name? Sir Kenneth, what's his face? Under the bus.
Was it Robinson?
Yeah, he throws Ken Robinson under the bus. I'm like, do it. I'm not a fan of him either. That's fantastic. But like his reason for doing it is that he says that the value of the education isn't to train people to be clerical workers in, you know, 1980, like not even 1980s, 1930s, like stenographers. That's not the point of school. The point of school is to give you enough knowledge to like be curious later about various things, versus Sir Ken Robinson would say like, no, you know, school is killing creativity. And he comes back with his own stats and would be like, no, people are actually plenty creative. I don't know, you know, like they had like a stat war of it basically about whose stats you're looking at for school killing creativity, or Leslie would say school inspires creativity because you have this kind of broad survey of things. But I think you have to do well enough at school, right? This is that inverse you're talking about. That if you have no knowledge of something, if I fail every history class I've ever done, then I'm not going to have any idea about, you know, world events of the past. And then I'm not going to be curious about those later. So that doesn't serve me, you know, as a person who's excited or energized or curious. It doesn't serve my curiosity. But if I do well enough at school, apparently, whatever that means, and get some pieces of knowledge, then that later will build my curiosity more. So that was my minor fight about the definition of experiential education. But in reality, I'm like, okay, this makes some sense. I don't know. What was your take on those pieces?
I think I skipped those chapters probably for that reason. That I think for me, the middle of the book is where I kind of tuned out based upon the notes that I chose to write down. Because when I make notes of a book, I write the quote out that really meant something to me. And then I write down the page number. And so I think I jumped from the 70s to the 170s.
Yeah. I feel like it got a little slow in the middle. I would agree. Yes.
But there was one quote that I think really speaks to what you were saying about the value of school. And I wrote this down from the introduction, where he says, people who defer too much to the authority of their elders' ideas are less likely to transcend them. The world is in need of more curious leaders.
Yeah, that's great. We read that again. I sort of got all excited in the middle. Will you say it one more time?
Sure. He writes, people who defer too much to the authority of their elders' ideas are less likely to transcend them. The world is in need of more curious leaders. That
is so good. So good. The idea of transcending the ideas of the past. So we're not just clinging. If we're not curious, we're going to cling to what's known, it sounds like. And if we're clinging to what's known, we're stagnating, which is a tough spot to be in, is to stagnate.
It is. But I think sometimes that's the status quo, that there's this pull between
that's a definition.
Stagnation but also this exponential growth of technology and that struggle between those two. Right.
Yeah. And to be a curious leader, I think that part, I work a lot with folks in leadership, and there are these stereotypes of what leadership is that I think we fight a little bit, because people are not normally drill sergeants or dictators, you know, like that's, but that's, you know, this kind of weird popular culture view in our society. And I think the idea of being a curious leader means you need this sense of humility to say like, oh, I don't know something. And so I'm curious. Like if you're not, I think he gets to this a little bit later on in the book. If you don't have enough humility, you're not going to be curious either, because you have to and it's an admission that you don't know something to be curious.
Mm-hmm. Or that you can even learn from someone else.
Right. That there is value in what someone else has to offer.
Yeah.
Definitely. So that's some epistemic curiosity. Good times.
Absolutely.
Good times with that.
Diving deep.
Yeah, I love it. And I think in this section too, he talks about how skills come from struggle. I'm like, yes, I love it. That's one of the quotes I pulled out, that epistemic struggle is where you end up with skills and growth and knowledge and like an increase of those things.
Yeah.
So then we have empathetic curiosity.
Yeah.
What does that bring to mind for you?
What that comes like, I think he describes it as the thoughts and feelings of others. And that for me is how I've always operated. Like, I'm really curious about what other people are thinking. But more importantly, like, thinking is one thing, but understanding what you're feeling is a whole nother realm of intelligence. And a whole nother realm of understanding, because some people just don't know how they're feeling. But then when you can get curious and pull that out of someone else in an appropriately healing way, it can be amazing. It can be very insightful. It can be damaging too if it's not done in a healthy manner.
I've spent a lot of time working with folks on this, and Brene Brown talks about how we have 3 emotions: happy, sad, or angry, and that's it. Yeah. Like, if you ask anyone, they're one of these 3 things all the time.
Right.
And if you just Google like feelings wheel and the internet and look for images, you'll see these amazing charts that sort of start with, in the center are sort of the big kind of, I think it's in the world of psychology. Oh, like the movie Inside Out, you have those characters. Yeah. Each of them sort of represent one of the main sort of feelings that people have. But then then it branches out to like finer and finer tendrils of, like, are you happy? Like, cool. Are you like elated? That's different. Are you super stoked? That's a little different. Are you content? Is that piece of happiness? Okay, that's different. Are you, so we have these words literally in our vocabulary, but I think we don't attach them to ourselves very often. And I feel like I spend time teaching people vocabulary for their feelings, and it takes time. I think it is effortful, like you were saying, because we're not always in the habit. Not effortful for everyone, but for many people, effortful to be like, well, how am I feeling right now? What does that tell me? Like, what is true in me right now? Yeah. Because we kind of like operate externally, diversively perhaps, but that empathetic aspect, looking within ourselves, it is difficult at times to make a habit of that or practice that, or even to have the vocabulary for that. Like, am I feeling curious? Am I feeling hopeful? Am I feeling, whatever it is?
Yeah, because it's one thing to go deep into a subject, but when you go deep into yourself, that's where you start seeing, the past intersecting with the present and your hope for the future, and sometimes the demons and monsters of our past, and the doubts and insecurities of our present. And it can be scary to dive deep, and sometimes just shoving it down is good enough for, well, it's good enough for me at times.
Yeah, like
I won't speak for anyone else.
Don't always need to look. Don't go there all the time. But it is right. It's hard. It's effortful. And speaking back to experiential learning, that sense of reflection is where learning comes from, and the experiential learning models. Like, without reflection and internal reflection, as well as regarding external events or things or judgments or whatever, like turning that internally is how we grow and learn as people. Because then we come to like, oh, I am kind of like overly judgmental about in this situation. Like, what does that tell me about me? How am I going to act differently in the future? Do I want to act differently? What is this? How do I transfer this to the next step? But looking that, I think we do look externally a lot, and we enjoy the novelty of the external. But I think there is novelty internally too that we don't always get into. I think for a lot of the reasons you said, I would agree that people, it can be scary, or it can be off-putting, or maybe we don't want to know, or we don't want to label things. But I think that idea of like, once you add labels to things, then you have something to stand on or something to grow from.
Right. Well, and I think it comes back to the curiosity zone applied to yourself. So once you start to have knowledge of yourself, then you can start being more curious about it.
Absolutely. And I think there's also, and this other part is curious about other people, but about what other people are feeling. And so it's that sort of internal layer, not just like what other people are doing. It's that deeper, what are they feeling? What are they thinking? Like, how are they operating in the world around me? Which I think is fundamentally a very human trait, in that we're such social beings. Like, we care. And I think it gets boiled down to status sometimes. Like, oh, was my status higher or lower than this person? Or should I listen to them or not? That's kind of like the most, I don't know, primitive isn't really the right word, but like the most basic maybe understanding of why we should care about what other people think. But I think as humans, caring about what other people think and feel builds this sense of society and the sense of network that feeds us as people. This is Brene Brown again would say that we're hardwired for connection. So to build connection, we need to actually have an understanding of who this is we're connecting to, and who they are is how they feel, how they operate internally. That's not always obvious on the outside.
I mean, right there is all the reasons why we should be curious about other people.
Yeah.
Because it's not on the surface.
Oh, and I think we guess a lot too. This is the other field I work in. When people are having conflicts, they're like, well, they, obviously blah, 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 blah. I'm like, wait, it's obvious that they did what? Like, what's actually obvious about this situation? Oh, their behavior was, they did this just to piss me off. I'm like, did they care that much about you? Were they even thinking of you? And how do you know? Like we don't quite understand why people do things. And I think there are models and there's frameworks and there's ways to sort of parse out why people are doing what they're doing, why they're behaving, what's motivating behavior, what's motivating actions. But that doesn't really get into the how people feel unless you have a deeper conversation. Like, we can express it, we can show it, like, oh, they look happy, they look sad, or they look angry, right? Like, I think that's probably our level of assessment of other people, is happy, sad, and angry. Right. But to get into those finer details, I think takes a different type of curiosity.
Yeah. What a perfect example of, the empathetic curiosity from your perspective. That's great.
It is. Yeah. It's interesting. And classically, we think everyone operates how we act, right? So we're often projecting our values, our processes, our reasons, our why onto other people, and which is unfair. Fundamentally, we're not building connection by assuming people are like us, or we're not really building connection by assuming they're doing the things for the reason that you would have done that same thing. And so I think that's where the empathetic comes out, is those sort of deeper reasons in some ways.
Well said.
Thanks. I think we should kind of wrap up a little bit. Like, I love the end part where he talks about 7 ways to stay curious. We didn't even talk about the value of being curious. Like, what would you say? Why should you be curious? That's maybe like where we should go before we go about how to do more of it.
I've been thinking a lot about the question, how do you level up? And I think the answer to that question, no matter where you're at in your career or your life, leveling up means that you have to be curious about what is the other side of what you're trying to do look like. So the example that he gives in the book is like, diversive curiosity is like, what's on the other side of the mountain? So, leveling up. But then he's like, epistemic curiosity is about how do you survive once you get to the other side of the mountain? So for me, the value of curiosity is really answering fundamental questions about our life, about our work, about our relationships in ways that you can't really Google. You can't, right. You can't really just listen to a podcast or read a book and get the definitive answer for the question that you have. It's a process that involves, searching and work.
Right. And I think we are more, I don't know what the actual, I think we're happier, we're more actualized, we're more connected, we're more empathetic, we're more like all these things if we are curious too. I think it feeds back around to our lives. Like, I think the subtitle of the book is like the desire to know and why your future depends on it. And I think Leslie would say that your future depends on your curiosity, because without curiosity, your life shrinks in ways that are really meaningful. And I would say ultimately painful or distasteful or, not inspiring. So there's that. On to 7 ways to stay curious. I don't know if you remember this, but number 1 was stay foolish, which is great.
I wrote down these 7.
Oh, you did? That's great.
Yeah,
Me
I
too.
did. So I love most of these. So stay foolish is great. It makes me laugh.
Yeah. And I think that, which speaks to like being accepting of not knowing, like, and and open to novelty in some ways too. Like it seems like foolish to do something that's not tried and true at times. So like to break out of sort of these conventions and molds, which I loved. Number 2 is build the database. Do you have thoughts on what that one is?
I think about this one often because it's like, how do you know what you know? Mm-hmm. And for me, building a database is like building a database of knowledge, building a database of quotes, of things that you've read or things that you've watched. Just the mere be a hoarder of what you know. I'm a hoarder of books and knowledge and information, and that's part of my database.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I think this speaks back to what we were saying. Like, if you have enough knowledge, that spurs so much more creativity and curiosity, both.
Yes, I agree.
And then next was forage like a foxhog, which kind of is like 7 layers of like other people's thoughts in there.
Yes.
So I don't know if you have thoughts on this one.
I think it kind of speaks to what Epstein says in Range, just, being a generalized specialist or a general specialist, or however you want to explain it.
Right.
Be a foxhog.
Yeah. And so that's about pursuing depth and breadth also of knowledge in different domains.
Yeah.
Number 4 is ask the big why.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think
that's all I wrote down. Yeah.
You're like, oh, I got it. I will.
Got it.
But that's a sort of like I think this goes to the 4-year-old being like, well, tell me why about that. Why? Tell me more why. Like, and so there's like deeper levels of why I think is part of that, but also why from like a higher view, like why do we even think about this? Why do we care? Why is this important? Why, in those both perspective, which is great. Number 5 was be a thinker-er, which I'm like, dude, what is this word? Come on. But it's a combination of think and tinker. What are your thoughts on that one?
What's interesting is the phrase that kind of stands out in the notes was sweat the small stuff while thinking big. Mm-hmm. Get interested in process and outcomes. And that makes a lot of sense to me because I'm very much a creature of process. So I take the system of creating a podcast, for example. You have an idea or a story, you input it into the process, and plop out comes an episode. And so I'm curious about the process, but also the inputs and outputs, and I think that's part of being a thinker.
Yeah, I just don't like the word thinker, but yes,
it's too clever. Or trying to be clever.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, judgy. We can just be judgy about it all we want.
Exactly.
But the idea, I think my notes are just like, details plus big picture, process plus outcome, details plus vision. Like those, just holding both of those together for sure. Question your teaspoons, which I'm like, oh, okay, great. What does that say to you? I know, so judgy.
So I get nothing from question your teaspoons, but the quote that I wrote down was the one he shared was from composer John Cage that says, if something is boring after 2 minutes, try it for 4. If still boring, then 8, then 16, then 32. Eventually one discovers that is not boring at all. And I have no idea what that has to do with questioning your teaspoons, but that makes a lot of sense to me because generally once you get into something, again, it transforms once you get past that certain threshold of againstness that we have with it.
Sure. My note for this is fight boredom with interest in the mundane. So I think teaspoons are like the mundane, right? So that we're curious. Like this is, you can stay curious by looking at the mundane in a more in a new light, perhaps taking interest there. And number 7, turn puzzles into mysteries, which is, I think, a theme that came up several times in this book that I really enjoyed.
Yes, I agree. And this is my favorite one of the 7 steps, primarily because the whole idea that a puzzle can be solved but a mystery can't is just so mind-blowingly awesome.
I loved it. Yeah. Right. And so if our puzzles are things we solve, like a crossword puzzle, but mystery is something to explore forever and never quite get to the bottom to, then we can continue to be curious because it is a mystery. We don't get to the bottom. And I feel like some of these other pieces fit into like how to do that a little bit. Like, are we questioning the mundane? Are we looking wide and deep? Are we asking bigger and bigger why questions around here? Like these sort of different aspects of being curious help us do like look at puzzles as mysteries, which I think, I think if you do these 7 things, there's always something to be curious about.
Oh, for sure.
I have been an instructor for Outward Bound for many years. And one of the parts of an Outward Bound course that students sort of dread but are fascinatedly curious about is a solo experience. So each person is spread out individually, away from, out of sight, usually from everyone else. And they have food, they have water. It's not a survival experience, but they have no technology. We're in the wilderness area.
Nice.
And they have usually, anywhere from 24 to 48 to, hours of solo. And the instructors go and check on them. So they're not like 100% totally alone the whole time, but it is perhaps one of the most alone experiences they've ever had. And students tell me they're afraid of being bored. Like, well, what do I do? I'm like, well, here you go. Here's 7,000 things you can do. Well, here's 7. But boredom is somehow is to be feared, I think, in some way. And I think there are many reasons for this. And that's a whole nother book, I'm sure, about why we're afraid of boredom, or why this feels, but it's uncomfortable, I would say. Like there's within sort of our normal lives, even though someone would tell you they're bored, there's so many points of stimulation around you. And even like alone in the woods, there actually are these same ones, but they're not the ones you're used to. If you're one of the quotes I tell the students is like, a scholar is never bored. And I've had a student tell me, well, I'm not a scholar, so I guess I'm going to be super bored. I'm like, well, what are you going to be a scholar about while you're out there by yourself, for this length of time, and it's a fascinating experience to put people intentionally into what they would consider a boring space and to see what happens. And there's kind of the anxiety going into it a little bit, but also on the other end, they're like, oh, I actually did something this was a big thing. Like there's a sense of pride coming away from that. You're like, yeah, like this is not normal. We all know this is not a normal part of your life. And there is something to take away. And what did you learn? And there's just a lot of things that people learn or direct their mind to, or they journaled, or they have ways to capture their thoughts there, which I think is a really fascinating, like, engagement with boredom from the point of like, now you have to choose to be curious. Like you actually have to actively be engaged in this process, which I think is really, looking back on it now, one of the huge takeaways. Like, oh, I can choose to be curious. I can choose to like explore something or examine something externally or internally, like epistemically, or I can just be mild, I can be diversely curious for 24 hours and be like, oh, what's that over there? What's that noise? What's this over here? What's that? You can sort of appreciate all these sort of different experiences when you have limited in many ways, kind of your normal flow of your life, your normal habits of how you communicate and interact with people.
Yeah. What's interesting is, like, as you're describing just, boredom in the context of wilderness, I was thinking about the difference between like an ebook and a printed book. And I find that some books are just meant to be read a page at a time.
Okay.
And like like checking out an ebook from the library, you've got 3 weeks. And digital technology is so kind of like, if it's not grabbing you now, jump over here and grab this and do this and read, take it all in. You can have it all.
Yeah.
But then there's just some books that you can't read that way. And I'm thinking specifically of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I think it took me 2.5 years to read that book.
This is like the second time recently someone has mentioned this. I remember reading that book and really not liking it and being like, ugh, this guy. Ugh, you're so annoying. Why do I care about you at all?
Yeah.
So maybe I should go visit, whatever. But
well, no, and I'm not saying that you should, but it's just interesting how I think sometimes curiosity is a long game.
Yeah. This is true. I'm actually in a book club, and we recently picked a book that I started reading in 2010 that I've never finished.
Awesome.
So I'm like, I have to, like, it's great to have a deadline, and I've never gotten to the end of this book, and it's a little denser of a book, but I'm like, okay, I am gonna now have a reason to get through this. And I think it helps to have someone to talk with about it, because it's, but yeah, some things do take time. And I feel like we're both on the like physical book, like preference. I definitely prefer physical books to
me too.
Ebooks too. That's just, I think there is something to be said about the different types, the tactile nature, obviously, all these different things, but it is, the ones from the library too, they go back in 3 weeks. Like I can't linger over it. It's very true. Well, although I have my copy of Curious from the library, I've just been renewing. So there's, that's very handy. And it's physical. Like I have the physical version.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, this has been fascinating talking with you today, Chris. Do you have any final thoughts or takeaways or things that you think would make the book Curious or its ideas more applicable to people's lives?
So as I was kind of exploring my notebooks, so I have these 9x12 sketchbooks that I write my quotes in. And as I was searching for when I read the book, I got curious about what other books that I was reading at the same time. And at the same time that I was reading Curious, I was reading a book called Be More Pirate.
Okay, that sounds great.
Oh, it's a fantastic book. And the quote that I wrote down that I'll share is, the greatest change makers know that you can't get stuff done on a big scale by breaking rules alone. You have to provide an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
And if that doesn't sum up 2021, I don't know what does. But just this idea of getting curious about the alternative that we offer, not just tearing down what we don't like, but what is that alternative?
Yeah.
That's, I think, where my curiosity is inspired right now from 2 years ago.
That's great. Yeah. What is the better system? If everything's terrible, well, cool. Agreed. Yeah. What's better? What is that thing that's better? And I think
precisely.
That's fantastic. I love it. And Be More Pirate is a great title. I'm going to check that out.
And it's like a pink book with black ink. I mean, it's fantastic design.
Okay. I love it already. I have a very soft spot for piracy for many reasons, but great. Well, thanks so much for being with me here today, Chris.
Absolutely.
And it's been awesome talking with you.
Likewise. I feel so inspired by what you're doing. I always love talking about books. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. And this has been the Books Applied podcast, again by WSL Leadership. You can find episodes at wslleadership.com in the podcast section, and it is distributed through many places via anchor.fm. So thanks for listening and have an awesome day.